November 13th, 1943. Cape Torokina, Bougainville. The rain fell in sheets through the triple canopy jungle, turning the black volcanic soil into a sucking morass that clung to every boot, every foxhole, every shattered tree. Private First Class Daniel McCarthy pressed his cheek against the muddy earth, listening to a sound that had become more terrifying than any artillery barrage. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Somewhere in the green chaos above him, hidden among vines thick as a man's arm and trees rising 200 feet into the grey sky, a Japanese sniper waited. The enemy had already killed Lieutenant Harrison at dawn, dropping him with a single shot through the throat at 300 yards. Corporal Jensen had died an hour later, hit in the head while drinking from his canteen. Radio operator Williams had been next, killed while trying to call in artillery support. 3 men, 3 shots, 3 kills, and McCarthy's rifle company, K Company, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines, had not fired a single round in return. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese sniper was hunting them. But more than that, he was teaching the young Marines of the 3rd Marine Division a lesson they would never forget, a lesson about patience, about camouflage, about the brutal mathematics of jungle warfare where visibility measured in yards and death arrived without warning from angles no one could predict. This was not the war they had trained for at Camp Elliott in California, or during the long, rolling crossing of the Pacific. This was something older, something primal. This was warfare reduced to its most elemental form. 1 man, 1 rifle, 1 purpose. And on this rain-soaked morning in November 1943, the Marines were losing. The 3rd Marine Division had landed on Bougainville on November 1st, part of Operation Cherry Blossom, the Allied plan to isolate the massive Japanese base at Rabaul on New Britain. The strategy was elegant in its economy. Rather than assault the entire island and its 65,000 Japanese defenders, Admiral William Halsey had chosen Cape Torokina on the western coast, a location so remote and so lightly defended that it seemed almost an afterthought in Japanese planning. Intelligence had estimated 300 Japanese troops in the immediate landing zone. The actual number was closer to 270. The Marines came ashore expecting a bloodbath and instead found swamps, jungle, and a handful of bewildered enemy soldiers who retreated into the interior after brief firefights. By November 2nd, the beachhead was secure. 14,000 Marines and Army soldiers controlled roughly 6 square miles of coastal lowland, but security was an illusion, because while the Japanese lacked the numbers to contest the landing directly, they possessed something far more valuable in the dense jungle terrain of Bougainville. They possessed time, they possessed knowledge of the ground, and they possessed snipers who had been perfecting their craft since the beginning of the China War in 1937. Private McCarthy had learned about Japanese snipers during training. The lectures had been clinical, almost dismissive. Japanese rifles were inferior to American weapons, the instructors said. Their optics were adequate, but nothing special. Their doctrine emphasized individual marksmanship, but lacked the systematic training programs of Western armies. The message was clear. American Marines, raised on hunting rifles and target shooting, would have the advantage. Those lectures had not prepared McCarthy for this. The Japanese sniper in the trees above K Company was not some frightened conscript with a rifle. He was an artist. He had chosen his position with extraordinary care, somewhere in the cathedral-like upper reaches of the jungle, where the massive hardwood trees created platforms invisible from the ground. He had camouflaged himself with leaves, vines, moss, becoming part of the forest itself. He had waited, motionless, for hours, perhaps days, studying the patterns of the Marine patrol below, and when he fired once. The crack of the Arisaka rifle echoed through the jungle, bouncing off trees absorbed by the rain, impossible to locate. By the time Marines swung their weapons toward the sound, the sniper had already displaced, already chosen his next position, already begun the deadly calculus of selecting his next target. This was not sniping, as the Marines understood it. This was something closer to hunting, and the Marines were the prey. The silence stretched. McCarthy could hear his own breathing, loud and ragged in his ears. Around him, the men of K Company lay frozen in whatever cover they had managed to find, behind a fallen log in a shallow depression, pressed against the buttress roots of a banyan tree. No one moved, no one spoke, because movement meant death. Captain William Drake, commanding K Company, lay 20 yards to McCarthy's left. Drake was a veteran of Guadalcanal, one of the men who had earned the 3rd Marine Division its reputation. During the brutal fighting in the Southern Solomons earlier that year, he had seen Japanese snipers before. He knew what they could do. But Guadalcanal had been different. On Guadalcanal, the jungle was secondary growth, easier to see through, easier to fight in. Here on Bougainville, the jungle was primeval. Trees 200 feet tall blocked out the sun. Undergrowth so thick a man could not see 10 feet in any direction. Rain that fell constantly, creating a grey, dripping world where sound behaved in strange ways and visibility approached zero. In this environment, the Japanese sniper was not just a soldier, he was an apex predator. Drake made a decision. He could not keep his company pinned down indefinitely. They had an objective, a trail junction a half-mile to the east that needed to be secured before nightfall. The battalion was counting on them. The division was counting on them. 50 Marines could not be paralyzed by a single enemy rifleman. He signaled to his platoon leaders. 3 shorthand movements: suppress, advance, bound. The Marines understood. They had trained for this. Lay down covering fire while other squads moved forward. Leapfrog through the jungle using fire and movement. Classic infantry tactics, proven and reliable. What those tactics did not account for was an enemy who could not be seen, who would not reveal his position, who possessed the patience to wait through a storm of American bullets without flinching. The suppression began. Marines with Browning automatic rifles opened fire into the canopy, spraying 2 20-round magazines in long, traversing bursts. Me-1 Garands joined in. The distinctive ping of ejected clips punctuating the roar. Tracer rounds arced into the green ceiling, marking target areas for other shooters. It was an impressive display of firepower. Hundreds of rounds poured into the upper jungle. Branches fell. Leaves cascaded down like green snow. The noise was deafening, overwhelming, exactly what the doctrine called for. And then, First Squad, led by Sergeant Thomas Morrison, stood up to advance. Morrison made it 3 steps before the Japanese sniper killed him. 1 shot through the chest. Morrison dropped without a sound, dead before he hit the ground. The other Marines in First Squad dove for cover, crawling back to their original positions, dragging Morrison's body with them. The suppressive fire had accomplished nothing. The Japanese sniper had simply waited it out, conserving his ammunition, watching the Americans waste thousands of rounds on empty air. And when the moment came, when Marines exposed themselves to movement, he had taken his shot with the same cold precision as before. Captain Drake stared at Morrison's body. 24 years old. From Nebraska, a farm boy who could shoot the wings off a fly at 50 yards with his deer rifle. Dead in the first week of combat because an invisible enemy had turned the jungle itself into a weapon. This could not continue. Drake called for his scout sniper team. The Marines had brought 4 scout sniper teams to Bougainville. 2-man elements equipped with specially modified Springfield 1903 rifles, topped with 8-power inertial scopes. These were not the standard infantry weapons. They were precision instruments built on national match-grade receivers, capable of hitting man-sized targets at 800 yards in the hands of a skilled marksman. The scout snipers were supposed to be force multipliers, assets deployed to eliminate high-value targets like officers and machine gun crews. They were supposed to provide overwatch for infantry advances. They were supposed to tip the scales in favor of the Americans through superior training and superior equipment. But in the 13 days since the landing, the scout snipers had struggled. The jungle defeated their primary advantage, which was range. Visibility rarely exceeded 100 yards. Most firefights occurred at 50 yards or less. The heavy Springfield rifles, magnificent on a rifle range, became cumbersome burdens in the close terrain, and the unertal scopes, beautiful instruments of precision, fogged constantly in the humidity, rendering them nearly useless. The Scout sniper team assigned to K Company consisted of 2 men, Corporal James Mitchell, the shooter, and Private Richard Hayes, the spotter. Mitchell was 26, older than most Marines, a former competitive shooter from Montana who had grown up hunting elk in the mountains. He had qualified as expert marksman, scored in the top 2% at the Scout Sniper School at Camp Lejeune. On paper, he was exactly what the Marine Corps wanted, but the paper had not prepared him for Bougainville. Mitchell low-crawled to Captain Drake's position, Hayes following close behind. Both men carried their equipment in modified packs, the rifles wrapped in burlap to reduce glare. Spare ammunition distributed in canvas pouches across their load-bearing vests. Drake did not waste time with pleasantries. Japanese sniper, upper canopy. 3 kills. I need him dead. Mitchell nodded. He had been listening to the firefight, had heard the single crack of the Arisaka after each Marine fell. He knew what they were facing. Where did the shots come from? Drake pointed toward a cluster of massive trees roughly 50 yards to the northeast. Somewhere in that sector, maybe. The sound bounces, hard to tell. Mitchell studied the jungle through his binoculars, sweeping slowly across the green wall. Hayes did the same with the spotting scope, a 20-power unertal mounted on a small tripod. They were looking for the telltale signs that separated a position from background. Unnatural straight lines, color contrasts, movement. They saw nothing. The Japanese sniper was not merely hidden, he was invisible. This was the fundamental problem that had plagued American counter-sniper operations since Guadalcanal. Japanese snipers did not operate like their Western counterparts. American doctrine emphasized concealment through camouflage netting, ghillie suits, carefully prepared hides that broke up the human silhouette. The training was thorough, the equipment first-rate, but Japanese snipers in the Pacific did not use camouflage netting. They did not build hides on the ground. Instead, they climbed. They went up into the trees, sometimes 60 feet, sometimes 80 feet, sometimes higher, until they reached the canopy layer where the branches interlocked and the foliage was so dense that looking up from the ground revealed nothing but a ceiling of leaves, and once in position, they became part of the tree itself. Some Japanese snipers tied themselves to branches with rope, allowing them to remain motionless for hours without fatigue. Some constructed small platforms using vines and branches, natural furniture that blended seamlessly with the surrounding jungle. Some simply wedged themselves into the crotch of a large branch and waited, their bodies painted with mud and leaves, their rifles wrapped in vegetation. The effect was devastating. American troops trained to scan the horizon and the ground ahead found themselves facing an enemy who attacked from above, from angles no one thought to check. Entire companies would pass beneath a Japanese sniper without ever knowing he was there, only to have men start dying when they stopped to rest or eat or fill canteens. The psychological impact was profound. Marines stopped trusting the jungle. Every tree became a threat. Every rustle of leaves became an ambush. Sleep became impossible because the enemy could be anywhere, watching, waiting, patient as death itself, and the Americans had no effective counter. Mitchell understood this. He had studied the reports from Guadalcanal, had read the after-action reviews from New Georgia. He knew that conventional counter-sniper tactics failed in the jungle. You could not simply glass the area and spot the enemy. You could not set up in a hide and wait for him to reveal himself through movement. The jungle was too thick, the visibility too limited, the enemy too skilled. So Mitchell did something different. He looked down, not at the ground, but at the base of the trees, because while Japanese snipers were invisible in the canopy, they had to climb to reach their positions, and climbing left traces, disturbed bark, broken branches at lower levels, boot marks on exposed roots, small details that most Marines would miss, but that a hunter from Montana would recognize instantly. Hayes saw it first. There! 120 yards! 3 o'clock from the big strangler fig. Fresh scrapes on the bark. Mitchell swung his binoculars to the indicated tree. It was a massive specimen, easily 180 feet tall, its trunk 4 feet in diameter at the base. And yes, there were marks, recent marks. Someone had climbed that tree within the last few hours. But where was he now? The canopy was too thick to penetrate visually. The inertal scope, even at 8-power magnification, showed only leaves and more leaves. Mitchell needed the sniper to reveal himself, and there was only one way to make that happen. He needed bait. The tactic was dangerous, arguably cruel, but it was the only option that offered even a chance of success. Mitchell explained his plan to Captain Drake in quick, quiet sentences. Drake listened, his face expressionless, then nodded once. Do it. What Mitchell proposed was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. He would have a Marine deliberately expose himself in a way that would draw fire from the Japanese sniper. The moment the sniper shot, the muzzle flash would give away his position. Mitchell would have perhaps 2 seconds to acquire the target, aim, and return fire before the sniper displaced. 2 seconds, maybe less. The volunteer was Private Eugene Kowalski, a 20-year-old from Chicago who had joined the Marines 6 months earlier. He was small, fast, and utterly fearless in the way that only young men who had never truly faced death could be fearless. Drake explained the plan. Kowalski would stand up, take 2 steps, and drop flat. The movement would last no more than 3 seconds. It should have been long enough to draw fire while short enough to avoid getting hit. Should have been. Kowalski checked his helmet, tightened his chin strap, and crossed himself. Then he waited for Mitchell's signal. Mitchell settled into position behind a fallen log. The Springfield resting solidly on the wood, the inertal scope adjusted to maximum clarity. Hayes lay beside him with the spotting scope. Both men focused on the target tree. Mitchell raised his left hand, waited, then dropped it. Kowalski erupted from cover, running 3 steps before throwing himself flat behind a tree root. The movement was fast, controlled, exactly as planned. The Japanese sniper did not fire. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. The jungle remained silent except for the endless dripping of rain and the distant calls of tropical birds. The Japanese sniper had not taken the bait. Mitchell cursed softly. The enemy was too experienced, too disciplined, to fall for such an obvious trick. He had seen the movement, recognized it as unnatural, and held his fire. They would need something more convincing. Hayes spoke quietly. What if we make him think we're retreating? Mitchell considered this. A retreating enemy was a legitimate target, less likely to be bait. But how to fake a retreat convincingly enough to fool a sniper who had already demonstrated extraordinary patience and tactical awareness? The answer came from an unexpected source. Captain Drake had been listening to the exchange. He looked at Mitchell and Hayes, then at the 23 remaining men of K Company, and made a command decision that would later be studied in Marine Corps training schools as an example of adaptive tactical thinking under extreme pressure. We actually retreat, Drake said. 100 yards back, the whole company. We make it look real, because it is real. The sniper will think he's won, that he's broken our advance. He'll get confident. He might move to a better position to follow us. And when he does, Mitchell finished the thought. We kill him. It was audacious. It meant temporarily abandoning their objective. It meant giving ground to the enemy. But it was also the kind of unconventional thinking that separated successful commanders from dead ones. Drake issued the orders. K Company would conduct a tactical withdrawal to their previous position. No running, no panic, just a slow, professional fallback that would suggest a unit deciding discretion was the better part of valor. The Marines began to move, pulling back by squads, covering each other, maintaining fields of fire. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. A company that had taken casualties and decided the objective was not worth more losses. Mitchell and Hayes remained behind, hidden in a thicket of ferns 30 yards from the target tree. They did not move. They barely breathed. The inertal scope was focused on the upper branches, the crosshairs steady despite Mitchell's racing heart. The retreat took 15 minutes. When the last Marine disappeared into the jungle, silence returned. The rain continued its endless percussion on the leaves. Somewhere, a parrot screamed, the sound harsh and startling. Then Mitchell saw it. Movement. Subtle. Just a shift in the pattern of leaves about 70 feet up the target tree. The Japanese sniper was repositioning, climbing lower, perhaps preparing to follow the retreating Marines. For just a moment, for perhaps 2 seconds, a piece of his body became visible through a gap in the foliage. Not much, an arm covered in a khaki sleeve. But it was enough. Mitchell's finger tightened on the trigger. The Springfield roared. The recoil drove the scope momentarily off target, but Hayes was watching through the spotting scope. "Hit!" Hayes whispered. "Center mass, he's falling." The body came down through the layers of jungle, crashing through branches, bouncing off trunks, until it hit the ground with a wet thump. Mitchell and Hayes waited, rifles ready, watching for movement. Nothing. They low-crawled to the body. The Japanese soldier was dead, the bullet having struck him in the upper chest. He was small, perhaps 5'4", thin from weeks of limited rations. His rifle was a Type 97 sniper, a modified Arisaka with a 2.5 power scope. Good equipment, but nothing special. What was special was what Hayes found in the sniper's pack, a small notebook wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from the rain. Inside were sketches, drawings of American positions, notes in Japanese characters, kill tallies, 23 confirmed kills, 23 Marines and soldiers dead at the hands of this one man in just 12 days of fighting. Mitchell stared at the notebook, feeling sick. 23 families back home who would receive telegrams, 23 men who would never see another sunrise. And this was just one sniper. Japanese intelligence estimated there were dozens more operating in the Bougainville jungle. Captain Drake arrived with the rest of K Company. He looked at the dead sniper, at the notebook, at Mitchell. "Good work, Corporal." Mitchell nodded, but he felt no satisfaction, only a cold understanding that this was going to be a long campaign, because for every Japanese sniper the Marines killed, there would be another taking his place, climbing into the trees, disappearing into the green ceiling, waiting with the patience of a predator for the next American patrol to pass beneath his position. The Battle of Bougainville had only just begun. The problem, facing the 3rd Marine Division in November 1943, was not simply that Japanese snipers were killing Marines. The problem was that they were doing it in a way that defied every counter-sniper doctrine the Americans possessed. Traditional counter-sniper warfare relied on a simple premise. Snipers revealed their positions when they fired. The muzzle flash, the sound, the trace of the bullet in flight, all these provided targeting information that allowed trained observers to locate the enemy and either maneuver against him or call in supporting fire. But this logic collapsed in the jungle environment of Bougainville. The dense canopy absorbed muzzle flash. The rain and wind scattered sound in unpredictable directions. The thick vegetation made it impossible to trace bullet trajectories. And even when Marines thought they had pinpointed a sniper's location, by the time they brought weapons to bear, the enemy had already displaced, climbing down from his perch and melting back into the jungle. The 3rd Marine Division's Scout Sniper Section, operating out of divisional headquarters under the supervision of Major Thomas Reynolds, began compiling data from every sniper encounter in an attempt to develop a comprehensive response. What they discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. Japanese snipers on Bougainville were not operating as individuals. They were part of a coordinated system. Analysis of kill patterns showed that single snipers rarely engaged more than 3 targets before displacing completely. They understood that American doctrine called for immediate suppressive fire and aggressive counterattack, so they never stayed in one position long enough for those responses to be effective. Shoot, displace, reposition. Shoot, displace, reposition. Always moving, always one step ahead of the American response. Even more troubling was the discovery that Japanese snipers were being directed by observers using field telephones. Coastwatcher reports from Australian intelligence operators hidden in the hills around the American perimeter confirmed that the Japanese had strung telephone wire through the jungle, creating a primitive but functional communications network. forward observers, watched Marine movements and relayed information to snipers positioned along likely avenues of advance. This was not warfare. This was chess, and the Marines were losing. Major Reynolds called a meeting of all Scout Sniper team leaders on November 16th, gathering them in a sandbagged command post 100 yards behind the front lines. 8 men attended, representing the 4 Scout Sniper teams operating with the 3rd Marine Division. They were tired, frustrated, and increasingly aware that their training had not prepared them for this environment. Reynolds got straight to the point. "Gentlemen, we are being outfought. The Japanese have adapted to jungle warfare in ways we did not anticipate. Traditional counter-sniper tactics are not working, so we are going to develop new ones." He unrolled a large map of the American perimeter on a makeshift table constructed from ammunition crates. The map was covered in red marks, each one representing a confirmed sniper kill or wounding. The pattern was clear. Japanese snipers were concentrating their efforts along the eastern and northern edges of the perimeter, where Marine patrols were attempting to expand the defensive line to include key terrain features. "Our fundamental problem is visibility," Reynolds continued. "We cannot see into the canopy. The Japanese can see us perfectly from their elevated positions. They choose when and where to engage. We react after the fact. This is tactically unacceptable." Corporal Mitchell spoke up. "Sir, we tried using artillery to clear the trees. It doesn't work. The shells detonate in the canopy, but the trunks remain standing. And the Japanese just moved to trees we haven't shelled." "Correct. So we need to change our approach. We need to think like hunters, not like soldiers." This statement hung in the air for a moment. The Marines exchanged glances. Thinking like hunters meant abandoning doctrine, meant relying on intuition and fieldcraft rather than the formal training they had received. Reynolds saw their hesitation. "Listen to me. Every man in this tent grew up hunting. You hunted deer, elk, ducks, whatever game was available in your hometown. You learned patience. You learned to read signs. You learned to think like your prey. That is what we need now." He was right, of course. The Marines who had been selected for Scout Sniper training were almost universally rural men who had grown up with rifles in their hands. They knew how to track, they knew how to wait. They simply had not been taught to apply those skills to human targets in a jungle environment. Reynolds outlined his new tactical approach. It consisted of 3 elements. First, Scout Sniper teams would begin operating independently without attachment to infantry companies. They would patrol alone, moving slowly through the jungle, searching for signs of Japanese sniper activity. This violated standard doctrine, which called for snipers to provide overwatch for infantry operations. But Reynolds argued that the Japanese had proven too elusive to be targeted reactively. The Marines needed to become the hunters. Second, Scout Sniper teams would begin using deception techniques adapted from big game hunting. They would create false targets, set up decoy positions, and use sound and movement to lure Japanese snipers into revealing themselves. This was psychological warfare, turning the enemy's own patience and discipline against him. Third, and most controversially, Scout Sniper teams would be authorized to use captured Japanese equipment when appropriate. This included Arisaka rifles, Type 97 sniper scopes, and Japanese camouflage techniques. The goal was to become indistinguishable from the enemy, to blend so completely into the jungle that Japanese snipers would not recognize a threat until it was too late. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, Reynolds had transformed his Scout Snipers from a reactive support element into an aggressive hunter-killer force. What he had created was something the Marine Corps had never seen before, a unit designed specifically for jungle warfare, operating under rules that emphasized fieldcraft over firepower, patience over aggression, adaptation over doctrine. The new tactics were put to the test beginning November 17th. Corporal Mitchell and Private Hayes were assigned to patrol a section of jungle northeast of the perimeter, where intelligence suggested the presence of at least 2 Japanese snipers based on the density of kill patterns. They moved out before dawn, carrying minimal equipment, Springfield rifles with inertial scopes, binoculars, canteens, a few ration bars, nothing that would make noise or slow them down. But they also carried something new, a battered American helmet mounted on a stick, a decoy designed to draw fire. The technique was simple, but required extraordinary nerve. Hayes would slowly raise the helmet above the vegetation, simulating a Marine moving through the jungle. If a Japanese sniper took the shot, Mitchell would have a brief window to locate the muzzle flash and return fire. The problem, of course, was that raising anything above cover invited instant death if the timing was wrong. The Japanese sniper might be watching through his scope at the exact moment the decoy appeared. He might recognize it as a trick, or he might fire immediately, and if the decoy was too close to Hayes's actual position, the bullet might find flesh instead of steel. It was a gamble, but everything in the jungle was a gamble. They moved through the undergrowth for 2 hours, seeing nothing, hearing nothing except the endless drip of rain and the occasional cry of birds. The jungle seemed empty, but Mitchell knew better. The jungle was never empty. It was watching, always watching. At 09:30, they reached a small clearing created by a fallen tree. The massive trunk had come down sometime in the recent past, creating a gap in the canopy, perhaps 20 feet wide. Sunlight streamed through. The first direct sunlight Mitchell had seen in days. Hayes signaled for a halt. Something about the clearing bothered him. It was too perfect, too obvious a place for Marines to cross, which made it perfect for an ambush. Mitchell scanned the trees around the clearing through his binoculars. Nothing moved, but in the military, nothing was always something. They waited. 10 minutes, 20, 45. The patience that Major Reynolds had demanded was torture. Every instinct screamed to move, to do something, anything. But they remained frozen, watching, waiting for the jungle to reveal its secrets. And then Hayes saw it. Not movement exactly, but the absence of movement. There was a section of tree branches on the far side of the clearing that did not sway in the light breeze. Natural branches moved with the wind. These did not. Camouflage. Mitchell shifted his attention to the indicated area. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then his hunter's eye picked out the anomaly. The color was wrong, just slightly. The green was too uniform, too consistent. Real jungle foliage showed 1,000 shades of green. This showed 3, maybe 4. A hide, a very good hide, but not perfect. Now came the critical decision. Shoot first or draw fire. If they shot first and missed, the Japanese sniper would know he was compromised and would disappear. If they tried to draw fire and the decoy failed to fool him, he might simply wait them out, knowing that time was on his side. Mitchell made the choice. They would try the decoy. Hayes extended the helmet on the stick, raising it slowly above the undergrowth at the edge of the clearing. From 60 yards away, it would look like a Marine preparing to cross the open ground. 5 seconds passed. 10, 15. The crack of the Arisaka was sharp and loud. The helmet flew backward, a neat hole punched through the steel. But more importantly, Mitchell had seen the muzzle flash, a brief orange spark in the camouflage position. He had his target. The Springfield came up smoothly, the inertial scope centering on the flashpoint. Mitchell took a breath, let half out, and squeezed. The rifle roared. Through the scope, he saw leaves explode, saw the camouflage netting shift violently. "Reloading," he said calmly, working the bolt. Hayes was already glassing the position with the spotting scope. No movement. "Wait! Blood! I see blood on the branches. He's hit." They waited 5 more minutes before approaching. The Japanese sniper was dead, slumped against the trunk of the tree where he had constructed his hide. The bullet had caught him in the neck, killing him almost instantly. His rifle, a Type 97, was still clutched in his hands. Mitchell examined the hide. It was professionally constructed, using local vegetation woven through a frame of flexible branches. The position offered an unobstructed view of the clearing while remaining invisible from the ground. The sniper had probably been there for at least a day, possibly longer, waiting for targets to present themselves. In his pack, they found the same type of notebook that had been recovered from the previous sniper. Kill tallies, sketches, notes. This one had 16 confirmed kills. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But Mitchell also found something else. A photograph. The Japanese sniper, young and smiling, standing with his family in front of a small house, a wife, 2 children, a life that had existed before the war, consumed everything. Mitchell stared at the photograph for a long moment, then carefully placed it back in the sniper's pack. He and Hayes withdrew from the area, moving carefully, aware that where there was one sniper, there were often others. The techniques developed by Major Reynolds and implemented by scout sniper teams like Mitchell and Hayes began to show results by late November. Kill ratios shifted. Marine casualties from sniper fire decreased. Japanese snipers, encountering unexpected resistance and sophisticated counter-tactics, became more cautious, less aggressive, but the victory was never complete. The jungle was too vast, the enemy too skilled, the environment too hostile. Every day brought new challenges, new adaptations, new horrors. On November 20th, a Marine scout sniper named Robert Chen developed a new technique that would become standard procedure for the rest of the war. Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who spoke some Japanese, realized that sound could be used as a weapon in the dense jungle environment. He began using a small brass whistle to create sounds that mimicked Japanese bird calls, signals that enemy troops used to communicate positions. When a Japanese sniper responded to the call, revealing his location, Chen's spotter would mark the position and Chen would engage. The technique was devastatingly effective, but it required intimate knowledge of Japanese field signals and extraordinary courage. Because if Chen got the call wrong, if he alerted the enemy instead of fooling them, he would become the target. On November 23rd, Chen's luck ran out. He made a bird call in a sector east of the perimeter. A Japanese sniper recognized it as false and triangulated Chen's position based on the sound. The return shot killed Chen instantly, the bullet entering through his left eye. His spotter, Private James McGill, managed to locate and kill the Japanese sniper in the ensuing firefight. But it was cold comfort. Chen had been 23 years old. He left behind a young wife in San Francisco who would receive the telegram 3 weeks later. The mathematics of sniper warfare were brutal and simple. Even with improved tactics, even with better equipment and training, the jungle gave the Japanese an inherent advantage. They knew the terrain. They had been there longer. They were fighting on ground of their choosing. The Marines were visitors in hell. And by the end of November, as the 3rd Marine Division prepared to be relieved by Army forces and rotated back to Guadalcanal for rest and refit, Major Reynolds compiled his final report on sniper operations. The statistics told a grim story. The division had lost 423 Marines killed in action during the Bougainville campaign. Of those, 68 had been confirmed kills by Japanese snipers. Another 112 had been wounded by sniper fire. That was nearly 40% of all casualties directly attributable to an enemy force that numbered perhaps 40 to 60 men. 40 to 60 Japanese snipers had inflicted more casualties on the 3rd Marine Division than entire infantry battalions in conventional engagements. But the report also documented success. Marine scout snipers had killed 27 Japanese snipers through counter-sniper operations. They had developed techniques that would be taught to every Marine sniper for the rest of the war. They had learned to think like hunters, to use deception, to be patient in a way that matched and sometimes exceeded the patience of their enemy. Most importantly, they had learned that jungle warfare was not conventional warfare with trees. It was a completely different form of combat that required abandoning preconceptions and adapting constantly to an enemy who was doing the same. The lessons from Bougainville would be applied at Guam, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, and at Okinawa. Each campaign brought new challenges, new adaptations, new horrors. But the fundamental truth remained constant. In the jungle, the sniper was king, and the only defense against a king was to become one yourself. December 28th, 1943. The last elements of the 3rd Marine Division boarded transport ships at Cape Torokina for the journey back to Guadalcanal. Behind them, the American Division and the 37th Infantry Division took over the perimeter defense, inheriting a beachhead that had been purchased with blood and patience. Corporal James Mitchell stood on the deck of the transport, watching Bougainville disappear into the grey haze of distance and rain. In his pack, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, was his notebook. Inside were sketches, observations, lessons learned from 60 days of hunting and being hunted in the green hell of the Bougainville jungle. 27 kills. That was Mitchell's official tally. 27 Japanese soldiers, most of them snipers, eliminated through patient stalking, deception, and precisely placed shots. He felt no pride in the number, only a bone-deep weariness and the knowledge that he would have to do it all again. Guam was next, then Peleliu, then God only knew where else the war would take him, if he survived. But Mitchell also knew something else. The tactics he and the other scout snipers had developed on Bougainville would save lives. Marines landing on future islands would benefit from the lessons learned in blood. They would know to look up. They would know to use deception. They would know that patience was a weapon as important as any rifle. That knowledge was worth something. Maybe not enough to balance the nightmares that came every time Mitchell closed his eyes, but something. The transport rounded the northern tip of Bougainville, heading into open water. The jungle disappeared behind them, but its lessons remained, carved into the survivors like scars, written in the notebooks that would eventually make their way to training schools at Camp Pendleton and Camp Lejeune, whispered in the stories that veterans would tell to new replacements during the long Pacific nights. The 3rd Marine Division had gone to Bougainville as a force trained in conventional infantry tactics. They came back as something different, something harder, something that understood that survival in the Pacific War required the willingness to abandon doctrine and embrace improvisation. The Japanese had taught them that lesson at a cost of 423 Marine lives, but the Japanese had paid their own price. 2,458 enemy dead by official count, though the real number was certainly higher. Dozens of snipers eliminated, their rifles and notebooks recovered, their positions photographed and documented. The war would continue for another 20 months. The 3rd Marine Division would fight at Guam and Iwo Jima. Mitchell would survive both campaigns, earning a Silver Star on Iwo Jima for eliminating a Japanese sniper team that had pinned down an entire company for 8 hours. He would rotate back to the United States in July 1945, assigned as an instructor at the newly reorganized Scout Sniper School at Camp Pendleton. There, in the California hills, Mitchell would teach a new generation of Marines the lessons of Bougainville. Look up, always look up. The enemy is not always where you expect him to be. Use deception. Make the enemy come to you. Control the engagement. Be patient. More patient than you think possible. Then, be more patient still. Adapt. The jungle is not the rifle range. What works in training may kill you in combat. Learn, adapt, survive. These lessons, simple and brutal, would become the foundation of Marine Corps sniper doctrine for the next 8 decades. They would be refined, expanded, adapted to new enemies and new environments. But the core principles remained unchanged because they were based on a fundamental truth that Bougainville had revealed. Warfare in the jungle was not warfare in an unusual place. It was a completely different form of combat that followed different rules and rewarded different skills. The soldiers who understood this lived. The soldiers who did not died. On Guadalcanal, the 3rd Marine Division spent 3 months resting, training, and absorbing replacements. The camps were wet and miserable, but they were safe. No snipers in the trees, no ambushes on the trails, just mud, rain, heat, and the slow process of preparing for the next campaign. Major Thomas Reynolds used the time to formalize the counter-sniper tactics that had been developed piecemeal on Bougainville. He worked with division intelligence to create a comprehensive training program that covered every aspect of jungle sniper warfare. The program began with fieldcraft. Marines were taught to move slowly, to observe carefully, to think three-dimensionally. The enemy was not just ahead or behind or to the flanks. He was above, always above. Trainees spent hours staring up into trees, learning to identify the subtle signs that indicated human presence, unnatural color, symmetrical shapes, the absence of movement in a living jungle. Next came camouflage and concealment. Marines learned to construct hides using local vegetation, not the formal ghillie suits of conventional sniper training, but improvised camouflage that changed daily as foliage wilted and died. They learned to move without creating visual signatures, to control breath, to wait without fidgeting, to become part of the environment. Then came marksmanship under field conditions, shooting from awkward positions, shooting upward at steep angles, compensating for rain, wind, humidity, understanding how ballistics changed in the dense air of the tropics, learning to trust the scope even when every instinct said the target was impossible. Finally, came psychological preparation. Because counter-sniper operations were not just physically demanding, they were mentally exhausting. Hours of waiting, days without contact, the constant awareness that one mistake, one moment of inattention meant death. Reynolds emphasized that successful snipers were not just good shots, they were patient, disciplined, mentally resilient individuals who could function in isolation under extreme stress. Not every Marine possessed these qualities. The men who did became scout snipers. The men who did not returned to the rifle companies. By March 1944, when the American and 37th Divisions faced a major Japanese counterattack on Bougainville, the sniper warfare that had paralyzed the Marines in November was less effective. American soldiers, trained in the lessons the Marines had learned, were ready. They looked up. They used deception. They were patient. Japanese snipers still inflicted casualties, but the asymmetry was reduced. The hunters had learned to hunt the hunters. The final irony of the Bougainville campaign was that the elaborate airfields for which the Marines had fought never achieved their intended purpose. By early 1944, the advance of the Pacific War had moved so quickly that Rabaul was bypassed rather than assaulted. The Japanese garrison there, over 100,000 men, remained cut off and increasingly irrelevant as the war moved north toward the Philippines and eventually Japan itself. The airfields at Torokina launched raids against Rabaul, but they were never the war-winning assets that planners had envisioned. The real victory of Bougainville was not tactical or strategic. It was doctrinal. The lessons learned in that dripping jungle at a cost of thousands of lives on both sides transformed how the United States military approached jungle warfare. Not just the Marine Corps, but the Army as well. The techniques developed by men like Major Reynolds and Corporal Mitchell became standard operating procedure in every jungle campaign for the next 3 decades. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, El Salvador, Colombia, the Philippines. Every time American forces entered the jungle, they carried with them the hard-won knowledge from Bougainville. Look up, use deception. Be patient. Adapt. Mitchell himself never spoke much about his experiences after the war. He returned to Montana in December 1945, married his high school sweetheart, bought a small ranch in the mountains. He hunted elk every fall, the same elk he had hunted as a boy, but he never used a scope again, never looked through magnified optics at a living creature. Some things, once seen, could not be unseen. He died in 1986, at the age of 69 from complications related to malaria he had contracted on Guam. At his funeral, 3 other members of his old Scout sniper section attended. They did not speak about the war. They did not tell stories. They simply stood together, 4 old men who had shared something that could not be explained to anyone who had not been there. After the funeral, one of them, Richard Hayes, Mitchell's old spotter, stayed behind at the grave. He placed a small object on the headstone, a brass cartridge case, 30-06, Springfield rifle, from Bougainville. Hayes stood there for a long moment, remembering the jungle, the rain, the endless green ceiling that hid death in every shadow. Then he turned and walked away. Some debts could never be repaid, only remembered. The Pacific War produced many innovations in military tactics and technology, amphibious warfare doctrine, close air support, and the coordination of naval, air, and ground forces. But perhaps no innovation was as hard-won or as essential as the development of jungle counter-sniper tactics, because in the final analysis, the Pacific War was not won by technology or industrial might alone. It was won by individual soldiers and Marines who adapted, who learned, who found ways to survive in environments that defied conventional military thinking. The Japanese snipers on Bougainville were extraordinary soldiers, disciplined, patient, skilled. They used the jungle as a weapon in ways that shocked and horrified their American opponents. They inflicted casualties far beyond their numbers. They created a climate of fear that paralyzed entire units. But they also created something else. They created an imperative for adaptation that pushed American forces to develop new tactics, new techniques, new ways of thinking about warfare. The Marines who fought on Bougainville in November and December of 1943 went into that jungle as conventional soldiers. They came out as something different, something harder, smarter, more dangerous. They came out as hunters who had learned to hunt the deadliest game on Earth. Other humans, in terrain that gave every advantage to the enemy. And they won, not easily, not cleanly, not without terrible cost. But they won. The notebooks filled out by scout snipers like James Mitchell, the after-action reports compiled by officers like Thomas Reynolds, the training programs developed at Camp Pendleton and Camp Lejeune. All of these became the foundation for American military operations in jungle environments for the next 80 years. Today, Marine Scout sniper training includes a module specifically on Bougainville. Instructors teach the principles developed in that campaign. Look up, use deception, be patient, adapt. The specific techniques have evolved, the equipment has improved beyond recognition, but the fundamental lessons remain unchanged because warfare in the jungle is eternal. The trees do not care who fights beneath them. The rain falls on Americans and Japanese and Vietnamese and insurgents with perfect equality. The jungle hides all and reveals nothing except to those who have learned its language. Bougainville taught that language at a cost of 423 Marine lives and perhaps 3,000 Japanese lives. A terrible price for knowledge, but knowledge that saved tens of thousands of lives in the decades that followed. On November 1st of every year, the 3rd Marine Division Association holds a memorial service for the men who fell on Bougainville. The ceremony is quiet, dignified. Names are read, stories are shared. Old men with faded tattoos and distant eyes remember friends who never made it home. And every year, someone places a Springfield rifle with an unertal scope next to the memorial wreath, a symbolic reminder of the men who hunted and were hunted in the green hell 80 years ago. The rifle is never fired during the ceremony. It stands silent, a monument to patience, to adaptation, to the terrible necessity of learning to fight and survive in an environment designed to kill. That rifle tells a story, not of heroism, though there was heroism. Not of glory, though glory was earned, but of something more fundamental. It tells the story of soldiers who faced an impossible situation and found a way through it, who adapted when adaptation seemed impossible, who learned when learning meant watching friends die, who survived through a combination of skill, intelligence, and sheer determined will to live. The jungle on Bougainville is still there. The trees that Japanese snipers climbed are still standing. Thicker now, older, draped in vines and moss, the trails that Marines patrolled have been reclaimed by vegetation. The positions that cost so much blood to secure are marked only by rusting equipment and the occasional bone fragment exposed by erosion. But the lessons remain, preserved in training manuals, taught to every Marine sniper, passed down through generations of soldiers who will never face Japanese snipers in Bougainville jungles, but who might face similar enemies in similar environments. Look up, use deception, be patient, adapt. 4 simple principles, learned in blood, remembered forever. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The war did not end on Bougainville. The 3rd Marine Division went on to fight at Guam and Iwo Jima. The techniques developed in those 60 days of jungle warfare saved lives on coral atolls and volcanic rock. They saved lives in Vietnam 30 years later. They save lives today wherever American forces operate in thick terrain against an adaptive enemy. That is the legacy of Bougainville, not a strategic victory, not the capture of an objective, but a transformation in how American forces thought about unconventional warfare. The Japanese snipers who climbed into those trees in November 1943 believed they had found an unbeatable tactic. They were extraordinarily skilled, magnificently camouflaged, patient beyond measure. They killed with precision and withdrew without trace, but they underestimated one thing: the capacity of their enemy to learn, to adapt, to become as patient and as skilled as they were. By December, the hunters had become the hunted, and by the time the 3rd Marine Division left Bougainville, the balance had shifted. Not decisively, not completely, but enough to show that the jungle, terrible as it was, could be learned, could be fought in, could be survived. That was the true victory of Bougainville. Not ground captured or airfields built, but knowledge gained, doctrine developed, tactics proven. The Marines who climbed aboard those transports on December 28th carried that knowledge with them. They carried it to Guam, to Peleliu, to Iwo Jima, to Okinawa. And when the war finally ended, when the transport ships brought them home to California and North Carolina and everywhere between, they carried those lessons still. Some became instructors, passing the knowledge to new generations. Some returned to civilian life, never speaking of what they had learned or how they had learned it. Some died in subsequent campaigns, their knowledge dying with them. But collectively, the veterans of Bougainville created a body of tactical expertise that changed American military doctrine forever. They proved that adaptation was possible, even in the most hostile environments, that learning could occur even under fire, that American ingenuity, when pressed to its limits, could match and exceed any enemy's tactical innovations. The jungle on Bougainville took much from those who fought there. It took lives, innocence, peace of mind. It gave nightmares and malaria and memories that would never fade. But it also gave something back. It gave knowledge, hard-won, blood-bought, invaluable knowledge about how to fight and survive when every advantage belonged to the enemy. That knowledge is the monument to the 423 Marines who died there, more lasting than stone, more permanent than bronze. It is a monument written in training manuals and inscribed in doctrine. It is a monument that has saved thousands of lives in the 80 years since those desperate fights beneath the green ceiling. And it is a monument that will endure as long as soldiers must fight in jungles, as long as enemies use terrain as a weapon, as long as war continues to demand adaptation and innovation from those who fight it. The rain still falls on Bougainville. The trees still stand. The jungle still hides its secrets. But the lessons remain. forever.